did emerge in a bat-infested copper mine 8 years ago, southwest China, where 3 men who worked there died of a disease almost identical to COVID-19. What happened to the infected human blood samples when they were brought here to a laboratory in Wuhan, in the city at the centre of the COVID crisis? Did COVID-19 come from a lab? Lab's chief scientist, Zhangli, admitted her team was studying a closely related bat virus that killed 3 miners 8 years before the pandemic struck.
People out there who had Facebook posts taken down were called kooks, conspiracy theorists, for saying publicly a year ago what we now say may be possible. And I think those people deserve an apology at a minimum.
The Wuhan lab was modifying viruses. The Wuhan lab was also storing bat samples. And from Chinese scientists to American funding agents, everyone kept misleading investigators.
Dr. Fauci could be personally involved in the origin of the Wuhan virus itself. Dr. Fauci authorized and funded risky research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In simple words, gain of function is a sort of experiment or experiments which involve genetically modifying viruses. So you create variants that are more infectious. Dr. Fauci authorized this kind of research domestically. He allowed American scientists to create more infectious versions of viruses. The Wuhan laboratory had samples of bat coronaviruses before the pandemic.
This is the worst cover-up in human history.
Texas lawmaker Michael McCall there, who was the top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. For a long time, mainstream media wouldn't touch reporting this theory, but in the last week or so, it has made serious headlines. Last week, President Biden started to take the theory the coronavirus originated in a Chinese lab more seriously. US intelligence agencies to investigate 2 theories. Either the virus originated from an infected animal that transmitted to humans, or it came from a lab leak. Cuomo, a few days ago, falsely claimed the theory is a newer notion, and that's something the United States government hadn't pursued yet.
COVID was passed from animals to humans, or it originated from a lab accident. Now, the second is a newer notion, okay? The government had not been open to the lab theory. That is why it is so politically charged. It was dismissed as a conspiracy early on.
You'll find China's Batwoman Zhangli herself. She's talking about what they do at the Wuhan lab.
After more than 10 years of research, we have proved that the SARS virus originated from bats. In addition, we have found that bats carry many other kinds of viruses, such as adenoviruses. Filamentous viruses also have other types of coronaviruses. The results of our research provide an important basis for the prevention and control of new infectious diseases in the future.
That statement is a confirmation. The Wuhan lab did have samples of multiple bat coronaviruses. Samples that China's Batwoman, Zhangli, didn't share with the WHO investigators who visited Wuhan. Zach. This man is the president of the EcoHealth Alliance, an NGO that channeled American funds into bat coronavirus research in China. Conveniently, Peter Daszak also happened to be on the WHO team investigating the origins of the virus on behalf of the WHO. No bats were sent to the Wuhan lab. We collect bat samples, send them to the lab. We release bats where we catch them. First, he said the Wuhan lab stored no bat samples. Then he got the Lancet to reject the lab leak theory. When the pandemic began spreading around the world, Daszak orchestrated a letter in the Lancet that rejected the idea of a potential leak. This is where Daszak publicly admitted that the Wuhan lab was modifying viruses to see if they could bind to human cells. The statement fits the description of gain-of-function research.
When you get a sequence of a virus and it looks like a relative of a known nasty pathogen, just like we did with SARS, we found other coronaviruses in bats, a whole host of them. Some of them looked very similar to SARS. So we sequenced the spike protein, the protein that attaches to cells.
The Wuhan lab was modifying viruses. After the outbreak last year, Zhangli claimed China had no samples that matched the Wuhan virus.
The three of the researchers were actually hospitalized in November of 2019 with flu-like symptoms consistent with COVID.
What you see is a dedicated animal room inside the lab. Bats are locked up inside cages. A scientist is seen feeding a bat a worm. This video is from 2017.
In 2014, the NIH awarded a $3.4 million grant. This was to a New York-based non-profit organization called the Eco Health Alliance. This group conducted research on bat viruses at the Wuhan Lab of Virology, the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. Eco Health Alliance paid the Wuhan laboratory more than $500,000 over a period of 5 years.
Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding of the NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute
Do they fund
of
Dr.
Virology.
Barrick in the U.S.? We have 11 labs doing it, and you have allowed it here. We have a committee to do it, but the committee has granted every exemption. You're fooling with Mother Nature here. You're allowing superviruses to be created with a 15% mortality. It's very dangerous. I think it was a huge mistake to share this with China, and it's a huge mistake to allow this to continue in the United States. And we should be very careful to investigate where this virus came from.
I fully agree that you should investigate where the virus came from.
The SARS virus had a 15% mortality. We're fighting a pandemic that has about a 1% mortality. Can you imagine if a SARS virus that's been juiced up and had viral proteins added to it, to the spike protein, if that were released accidentally? There was research done with Dr. Shi and Dr. Barrick.
Did the National Institute of Health in America provide funding to the Wuhan lab in China with the approval of the US State Department? This grant was approved in May 2014. 5 months later, the Obama administration announced it would not fund new projects that involved gain-of-function research, citing safety and security risks. Most believe the virus jumped from animals to humans, most likely in the wild. But a lot of people still believe that the virus was designed in a lab. Chinese virus hunters. It was released on the 10th of December 2019, around the same time when patients in Wuhan had begun showing pneumonia-like symptoms. This video shows a Chinese scientist on a mission inside a cave filled with horseshoe and poppistral bats.
蝙蝠的生活环境都在人迹罕至的洞穴，但只有这样的环境，才能找到最理想的病毒媒介样本。
蝙蝠它主要是菊头蝠和蝠翼蝠。如果说我们的皮肤裸露，很容易接触到蝙蝠的排泄污染的物体。
What was this man up to? Is this video linked to the pandemic in any way? The man leading this team is called Tian, worked with the Wuhan Center for Disease Control, or the Wuhan CDC. It is the agency that led China's early pandemic response. Early December 2019, Wuhan lab had access to some 22,000 virus samples and sequences. And all of these have now been taken offline. The WHO investigators, by the way, saw no problem with this. And they never really felt the need to even ask to see the database. The database was actually taken down in September 2019. It was 3 months before China officially declared an outbreak. This was 6 months before it was called a pandemic. Why did they delete the virus database in September 2019? Already know that the Chinese military was involved in the lab when the pandemic began. Major General Chen Wei, China's top virologist and biochemical expert, had moved to Wuhan with her team. What was an army general doing in a bio-research lab? It should only be a matter of time before the world pieces together the evidence.
A high-ranked Chinese official fled to the US and gave Washington evidence on the Wuhan lab leak. Dong Jingwei is the highest-level defector in the history of the People's Republic of China. Informing the US officials about where the COVID-19 may have emerged, it is being suspected that this urged President Joe Biden to look seriously at the lab leak. If this report is true, then it would mean a huge leap towards the probe against China.
Starts in a remote, abandoned copper mine in southwest China, where a coronavirus very similar to the one that causes COVID-19 was found. 3 men who worked there died of a disease almost identical to COVID-19. Did COVID-19 come from a lab?
An accidental leak, or you've got an accidental jump from a bat, an intermediate species, into a human.
2012. The abandoned mine is near the tiny town of Tugun, deep in China's southwest Wuhan province. Unknown to the men working there, the bats populating the mine and the bat feces they were shoveling contained an unknown coronavirus that would later be named RATG13. Around 2 weeks after entering the mine, the miners fell sick with a strange flu-like illness. These Chinese medical records, kept secret for years, showed their symptoms were identical to COVID-19.
All of those symptoms, we would recognize them today as COVID-19.
3 of the 6 infected miners died, one lingering in hospital for 5 months before succumbing to the strange illness. Time enough, according to Dr. Latham's research, for the bat virus infecting the sick miner to mutate into a coronavirus that was now capable of being passed on to other humans, 8 years before it erupted in Wuhan.
The length of time that these miners were in the hospital, they were basically incubating this virus for a very long time. And so that gave the virus an opportunity to evolve, to adapt to human lungs.
Blood samples from the dying miners were sent to China's highest security biolab, to the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
They had tests that they sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which tested positive for a coronavirus.
And samples of the bat coronavirus taken from the feces in the mine were also taken to the Wuhan lab. Comparison tests would later reveal it was a 96% match to COVID-19. What was once dismissed as a conspiracy theory has become a legitimate scientific debate. Is it possible that COVID-19 already existed and was being researched and accidentally escaped from the Wuhan lab, sparking the pandemic? Dr. Robert Gary, he agrees there is evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was carrying out research on the bat coronavirus called RATG13 and on samples from the dead miners. He says it's scientifically impossible for the bat virus to have mutated into COVID-19 either in the lab or in the bodies of the dying miners.
Not feasible, not plausible. That would take about 50 years of natural evolution.
Gain of function research, which is where you pass the virus through an animal host over and over again. So you're basically speeding up nature.
Shi Zhengli has confirmed that she and her team conducted gain-of-function engineering on bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The type of research that was taking place here that raises eyebrows. It involved the manipulation of viruses for research, which made them incredibly dangerous. Shi Zhengli affirmed that she did take samples of the copper mine virus to study in Wuhan. That virus that infected the miners in the copper mine could have been deliberately mutated into COVID-19 through the controversial and risky research technique.
The risk is we now have created something that didn't exist in nature, which is a highly lethal human virus.
If we are engineering a virus that could wipe out humankind, it is literally like we're building the Death Star, and if something goes wrong, then everybody dies.
It was outlawed in the United States. It's now been actually brought in. Interestingly, when it was banned in the United States, the research was actually moved to the Wuhan Institute of Virology because it wasn't banned in China. And so, in fact, at one point, the US government was funding the gain-of-function research that we've seen published.
Dominic Dwyer, he said he believed the lab was definitely part of their mission.
The laboratory leak is a very reasonable hypothesis because it's happened before.
February 9, after scarcely 2 weeks on the ground in Wuhan, WHO team leader Peter Ben Emberak initially announced the lab leak theory would not be investigated. Political dynamite. Chinese scientists were allowed to promote the widely debunked claim that COVID-19 was brought into China in frozen food. Some scientists on the Wuhan team reported deep frustrations in their attempts to obtain any detailed data from the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
I don't think the wet market is the origin of the pandemic because the first 2 cases hadn't been to the wet market from the Wuhan cluster, and half of the cases in that cluster had not been.
No trace of the COVID-19 virus was found in the animals that were sold at the market.
None of those samples showed a coronavirus in the animals that were sampled.
Said this could be a laboratory leak. I guess the scientific establishment then said, well, if Trump said that, we have to drive the opposite agenda to prove that Trump doesn't know what he's talking about.
He basically pushed all those people to say, hold up, we need to stop this.
Lab's chief scientist, Ji Zhengli, admitted her team was studying a closely related bat virus that killed 3 miners 8 years before the pandemic struck.
These miners were infected with a coronavirus.
The whole point is there are people out there who had Facebook posts taken down, were called kooks, conspiracy theorists, for saying publicly a year ago what we now say may be possible. And I think those people deserve an apology at a minimum.
Cameras in Wuhan. Proof of a cover-up from the beginning.
So SARS-1, we identified the host animal within 4 months. MERS, I believe we identified the host animal within 9 months. It's now been 15 and a half, 16 months. We've still not seen, and China's not produced any evidence of the host animal that transmitted COVID-19 to a human. We know that China has a history of lab accidents. I think back in 2004, 2 researchers in Beijing were infected doing research on SARS and led to an outbreak. This outbreak happened in a city that happened to be the home, coincidentally, of a lab which we know is involved in extensive research. And what they do is they take this naturally occurring virus and they manipulate it and they change it to make it infectious to humans. We know that they do that there. They've published about it. And it also happened in a city, in a lab, where a Rutgers biosecurity expert raised concerns about its safety, and our diplomats in 2018. All these facts are available to us.
I have always said that the high likelihood is that this is a natural occurrence. The historical basis for pandemics evolving naturally from an animal reservoir is extremely strong. And it's for that reason that we felt that something similar like this has a much higher likelihood.
On November 5th, 2020, the United Kingdom went into lockdown. And if you look at the chart of cases, it seemed to work. In early December, the overall drop in cases led the country to relax restrictions anyway. And then, this happened. The virus itself had changed. It was a new variant. It was more contagious, and it was spreading. It had spread to most of Southeast England. 2 months later, it was in 30 other countries. 5 months later, it was the most common form of the virus found in the United States. More and more variants are emerging in various places around the world. But the longer a virus is around and the more people it infects, the more it will change. And the more those changes accumulate, the more chances the virus has to evolve into something more dangerous. Delta, the most recent addition to this list, has been referred to as a double mutant, because while it has many different mutations, it has 2 significant ones we've seen before. This mutation seems to make the virus more transmissible. And a version of this one, found in 2 other variants, makes it easier for the virus to reinfect people who have already had COVID-19.
If you give the virus enough time and replicative cycles, it will sample a very large evolutionary space and find a solution to the problem we've presented it, which is vaccination and widespread immunity.
As long as the pandemic continues, and as long as the virus continues to spread, it will continue to make copies of itself. We aren't getting those vaccines around the world fast enough, which is only giving the virus more time to change and ravage areas of the world that are still waiting.
we need to stop this because we don't want a variant that affects immunity. And so that involves stopping replication everywhere.